Those who'd heard of the study nicknamed it the monster study. It reminded people of Nazi experiments on human subjects.
Of the time, it's right in there.
Of the time, wasn't it? Other professors at the time told Wendell Johnson it would ruin his reputation if he published this. So the main goal of the study was to see whether telling non-stuttering children that they stuttered would make it happen. That's cool.
I mean, cool science. Just, possibly.
Finding shit out. Yeah. And what did he need next, obviously? Children.
Yes.
Luckily, his uni had an existing and ongoing relationship with the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home in Devonport.
Orphans.
How'd the experiment go? People who didn't have a stutter but were told they did.
Ethically wasn't a great study.
5-year-old called Norma Jean Pugh. It was very difficult to get her to speak, although she spoke very freely the month before.
God.
She didn't want to talk. 9-year-old Betty Romp practically refuses to talk, held hand or arm over her eyes most of the time. Hazel Potter, 15. She became much more self-conscious. She started to snap her fingers and to try and stop herself because she'd often say, before words. One boy refused to read anymore in class. He wouldn't recite stuff. An 11-year-old called Clarence, who was described for some fucking reason, chubby and diffident child. To be fair, that's how most of my school reports from primary school were as well. He began to start anxiously correcting himself. He stopped and told me he was going to have trouble on words before he even said them. 12-year-old woman called Mary, or girl at the time. Did your best friend know about your stuttering? And she said no, because I hardly ever talk to her now.
Oh, great. Yep. Cool.
So in 2003, anyway, there were 3 surviving orphans from the You Don't Stutter, but we're going to tell you that you do group, the most messed with group. Yeah. All 3 of them sued the state and the University of Iowa for millions. So one of them said she thought of herself as a freak all her life. She still hates to talk, except to her family and a few people in church.
So it's 60 years later?
Yeah. Another, imagine trying to wreck a child's voice. I've moved on. I married a good man. I talk okay. And one other one, I could never tell my husband about it. It just ruined my life. The history of science, it's peppered with some dubious research.
Oh, sure.
You could almost say liberally sprinkled. And there are a number. I think we've touched on some of these and we haven't touched on others, but we'll get there. So there's things like, where dudes were grafting a second head onto a dog to see what they could do.
Do you know that was an undergrad research project?
Fuck. What do I do for my PhD? Craft myself to a car? What do you do?
It was like Moscow State University or something like that.
Go get 2 dog. Well, actually 1 dog and one piece of dog. There are these great ones, the parental attachment studies they did with baby macaques. I don't know if you know much about those. They're not great.
I do know parental attachment studies, but not the baby macaques.
Kind of like trying to test how much, attachment to mother and stuff matters to an infant's development. Turns out a lot.
But they're macaques.
So who cares? Only fucking monkeys. Right, exactly. I'm with you. There's more recent studies. You grow bits of human brains inside mouse embryos and they grow human brain elements, which is fine. Classics, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which one day I'm sure one of us will.
Yeah.
Anyway, Little Albert, the infamous. You don't know that one?
It's like Fat Albert's.
Yes, Fat Albert when he was a child.
I don't know.
Bill Cosby was deeply involved.
Little Fat Albert.
No, the really quick gist is they wanted to talk about it was either operant or classical conditioning, where you pair a stimulus with a thing that's unrelated, and then you
slow down, egghead. In what?
Bottom line was they got a little kid, and the classic was showed him a white fuzzy bunny, and he went, white fuzzy bunny. Then they'd show him a white fuzzy bunny and like bang a gong or something. A kid would go, Jesus Christ, freak out and cry. Eventually you could take the gong away and just show him the white fuzzy bunny and he'd wig out.
Cool. So like Pavlov, but we're being cruel to kids.
Horribly worse.
Okay.
I'll tell you about that one day. And there's also one called Unit 731. Ultra fucked up Japanese experiments on prisoners of war.
Oh no, that is my fail safe. You will never do this because that is too far.
It's the way I'll tell it.
I've got that in my list, and that's why if I do that, then it's like that's it. You've run out of humanity.
Yeah, it's true. But so all these projects, let's call them, they have really benign or ambiguous names on the whole. Like Little Albert doesn't mean much. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment doesn't really tell you much. Unit 731.
Syphilis. Yeah, okay, Unit 731.
Doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah, sure.
So I find that kind of intriguing because often what they did underneath these bland descriptions, etc., was fairly So what I think is interesting, though, is these bland names, they represent such horrible realities of these bland descriptions. So what in the hell would they have done in a study that was come to be known as the monster study?
Ooh. Welcome to The Wholesome Show, the podcast that deftly wraps its tongue around the whole of science.
See, that's a good one.
I have no problem with that.
And it's on topic.
I'm Will Grant.
I'm Rod Lamberts. Wendell Johnson was born in 1906, and as a boy, he, quote, stuttered grotesquely. He was often rendered speechless by his impairment.
Okay.
So he really
stuttered
hard.
It was a big thing.
Stuttered hard. So apparently he'd spoken just fine until he was 5 or 6, and then a teacher said to his parents, I think he's starting to stutter. And this turned into an obsession with his speech from his parents and from him as well. And they're like, what the fucking... So his voice became more hesitant, and he self-consciously would repeat sounds, and basically he started to become super aware. So there are all kinds of ways to try and treat him, and it ran the gamut of early 20th century stuttering therapies.
He wasn't one of those left-handers that had it drummed out of him or anything?
Handedness comes in, but not dramatically.
Anyway.
So family doctor gave him sugar pills.
Like a placebo. Let's see if the placebo fixes him.
Or maybe
or some sugar.
Maybe in 1912 they thought sugar had healing properties. Faith healer would scream from a stage and try and, kind of help him out by wrath of God and all that shit.
By screaming from a stage. Okay.
Yep. Chiropractor, you seem to be stuttering. Let's snap your spine.
We're going through a lot of the not the cures I would have guessed.
Not your first.
Not the first ones.
No, not your first. At 16, he was apparently becoming almost unintelligible with his speech. He begged to be allowed to go off to a stuttering school. I don't know where it was, but it was not where he was, so he had to take a choo-choo train. And he was there for 3 months, and he was asked to do things like recite aloud in a very monotonous and deliberately flat tone while swinging dumbbells like a metronome and chant, have more backbone and less wishbone.
Like early 1900s, quack remedies, that's a good one. But they really did seem, let's go in on the brutal. And
that wasn't one of the quack ones. that was a good one.
Have more backbone and less wishbone. Maybe that's a pretty good, like a gym poster. Like, pain is weakness leaving the body.
Yeah. What is it? Hurdle the dead and eat the young or something? That was another one I saw on a woman at the gym wore this on her T-shirt. I was like, damn.
Yeah, but there you go. Have more backbone, have less wishbone. Put that on a gym poster.
I used it to warm up before we started recording.
Yeah, fair enough.
It didn't work. Didn't work. Nothing happened. Nothing worked. So he quit, and he said, the quote was, I went to the station, stuttered to the ticket agent and to the conductor, and basically closed my eyes in despair. He went home. So his inability to express himself meant he was more into writing and literature. Not surprisingly, he didn't want to do the talky stuff. And apparently he developed a penchant for antic humour. So he was, a physical gag guy and liked to make jokes. I assume practical jokes.
Yeah, fair enough.
And apparently so he was quite popular.
He does the writing and the physical gags, but not the speaking. So
Yeah. And apparently he's quite popular. He didn't speak much, but he entertain people. They liked him. He ended up being class president, and he was the valedictorian of a tiny little high school that he went to in Roxbury.
Oh, good on him.
Kansas.
That's nice.
So anyway, he was apparently a real clown, and the people in his hometown thought he was great. 1926, so 20 years old, 2021, he goes to uni in Iowa, the University of Iowa, to study English. But also at the University of Iowa, and I'm not sure if this is a coincidence or not, it had the most famous center for stuttering research on the planet. Apparently one of his former students who became an emeritus professor because he retired of speech, etc. at Brooklyn College. So he was very well known at the end. Like most stutterers, he was baffled by his stuttering. He's like, why do I do this?
Why do I do this?
What the hell is going on?
Fair enough.
So apparently he got right into sussing it out. So he spent hours trying to figure out what he was doing that made him and basically anyone stutter. Like, what is it that I am or am not doing? Why the fuck is this happening? Asking questions like, what is it that makes people stutter? Are there patterns to stuttering? Are there something?
Yeah, sure.
Like, what the hell's going on? Which I think is very reasonable. Smart dude who's got what seems to be quite a debilitating situation.
And that you feel otherwise normal, but not able to get the words out.
Yeah. I think it'd be horrible. When I've interacted with hardcore stutterers, I just think, I want to help. And that's, I think, at times worse because you kind of, what do? Do you help? Do you stay dead silent? It's fucking hard.
Put them in a wheelchair and you push the wheelchair. I think that's what they say.
That's what they're saying.
Yeah, that's what they're saying.
And a morphine drip.
Yeah.
Yeah, the suffering, you can see it's palpable and it's horrible to watch. So at the time, mid-1920s, speech pathology, he says, getting that word wrong, was really in its infancy. And so people weren't really, there were lots of ideas, but it wasn't really a coherent field. And it was struggling to be seen as a real science. It wanted to be bona fide, etc. So the Uni of Iowa was right at the vanguard of this. Handy. So by the time Wendell got there were all kinds of studies going on. And he was really keen. So he went there for English, but he ended up going into psychology instead, did his master's in it.
Okay.
And he basically said, I became a speech pathologist, probably wrote it, because I needed one.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. They don't really exist at the time.
Nope.
If it's just swinging your dumbbells and getting yelled at by
not being a
religious folk.
And eating sugar. So many of his fellow graduate students also were terrible stutterers. So they would, because
they're all in on it to find out. Yeah.
Yeah. So they'd use each other as guinea pigs.
Yeah, I can understand that.
And the things they would do, it's just quite a wide range. So they'd draw blood, they'd hook themselves to electrodes, they'd bash their knees to test reflexes. They'd be walking around and they would carry notebooks and they would literally stop mid-conversation and walk if one of their colleagues said something in a weird stuttery way to make a note of it to see if that could be useful, which is not a bad idea. They'd shoot guns off and make loud noises right next to each other's ears to see if being startled would affect your stuttering.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out it didn't. But if you do it to a normal speaker,
useful
it does.
to try. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
They'd also do things like, and this is the left-handedness comes in, they'd put casts on each other's dominant arm because there was a theory about if you were dominant right-handed and forced to write with your left or left and forced to write with your right,
yes,
it would tangle your brain somehow.
Well, that's not a bad one.
It's not terrible. And we did talk about, well, you told me about that.
I did.
So he did a specific study early on. So this one, he would give stutterers a page that was bordered in red, so it'd have a red border around the page. And you get them to read it aloud in front of an audience.
Okay.
Which of course, well not of course, apparently would make their stuttering way worse, because definitely
an audience makes it worse.
Doesn't help, at least in general. Afterwards, they would then tend to stutter anytime they read a page marked with red, even if they were reading it just to one person, not even an audience.
So some sort of visual trigger or something going on, or a psychological trigger. Yeah, okay.
Then what he did next was he blacked out words where the person who was reading would particularly stutter. He would black out the words where they stuttered. So he'd get them to read and go, oh, there's a word they stuttered on.
So get rid of that word? So don't say that word?
Yeah, just block them out.
So just skip the bits of the speech where you're stuttering?
Well, I don't know if they were given instructions, but he just did that and he gave it back to them. And when they read it again and they reached the word next to the crossed out one, they would stutter next to the crossed out one.
Oh, okay.
So there were, again, these triggers, they started basically, they were conditioned to stumbling at that point in the text. So he also showed that individual stutterers were consistent. They weren't necessarily consistent between stutterers, but individuals had particular
they had their own
patterns
thing.
And habits. Yeah,
like what you mean, particular triggers or particular words or particular
words, particular sounds. So like they'd stumble over the same sounds, and they'd dread the sounds they'd stumble over. So you'd get people, they'd try and say, like my and they dad, change the word. Because they couldn't get farther. Fricatives, the f's and so on, were often difficult. They'd whisper. When they're about to reach some of these troublesome fricatives, he noticed their eyes would bulge.
So the fricative is the
these kinds of noises. Yeah. They'd bash their knees, they'd click their fingers, they'd shake their head, they'd try and force the sound out or get rid of the disruption. So they'd work very hard on this. But this would vary between stutterers. I mean, it's just my heart goes out to these people because what a fucking nightmare not being able to express yourself clearly for whatever reason. But he also noticed situation-specific effects. So, for example, there were certain situations where even terrible stutterers would not stutter. So like when they were singing or if they were having and there was that King's Speech movie that had that dude in it that did
was
something
the King's
that had
Speech
movies. I mean, songs in his ears or something. I watched it. So he noticed this was interesting. Also, if they were speaking with children or dogs, so there was no pressure to be understood or they didn't feel so.
I like that.
I do too.
I did learn the other day that dogs recognize the voice that you put on when you're speaking to your dog, which must be different.
Meaning if you put on your Russian accent, your famed Russian accent. Well,
depending on what accent you use to speak to your dog. Some people might speak in their Russian accent, some might use others, but dogs learn that
so the dog goes, Muscovite
That
Russian.
is the voice for me. That's the one where you're talking to me.
So you can have your special dog accent.
Yeah, exactly. And you shouldn't do that in front of other people. If that's your...
I do though.
Yeah, well, everyone does a little bit.
But my dog voices aren't racial.
No, sure. Why would they be? Why your dog is not a racist, so it's not going to appreciate.
I think one of them is. She's the bogan dog. Staffy, I told you, bogan dog. There was also the story of a stutterer who severe stutterer who, talking about the situation-specific stuff, basically lived a life of a nomad because he could communicate vocally only when he was establishing himself in a new town.
But once he gets to know people?
Apparently.
Oh, wow.
So the results that he saw from the red borderline and stuff, and also the observations of people having situation-specific stuff, basically he was utterly convinced stuttering was a conditioned and learned response.
Only?
Only.
Only.
He was like, this was his
So
jam.
anyone can get it, but these people have been conditioned by it.
Mm-hmm. And he believed basically associated behaviours of stuttering would go away if the stutterer could relax and didn't anticipate some kind of speech blockage or problem. So this was radical because in the 1920s, early 30s, the main theories were basically physiological. There's something wrong with misdirected brain signals or something in the brain. And the senior professors at his uni in Iowa were very much proponents of this, and this was the university for this. But he said, nah, bullshit. Partially because his own experience did not support that theory.
His own experience doesn't mean that there isn't a physiological bit in him.
Are you arguing with Wendell?
I just saying
Wendell Johnson and
one's
you
own
having
experience can't close that loop.
It's a small sample space.
Yeah.
But he said, look, for example, he had no family history of stuttering. So it's like, how the hell could it be inherited if there was nothing to inherit? And apparently a former student of his who became quite famous in the world said basically stuttering is learned behaviour was kind of like his mantra. Like it's learned behaviour, it's learned behaviour. He was very, very strong.
Yeah. Mantras aren't typically that great in science. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that it becoming a mantra doesn't.
Apologies to our Buddhist listeners.
It becoming a mantra doesn't mean it's science.
No, but that's what he was convinced. Like he was utterly convinced. This is the jam. This is the stuff. And he had anecdotal data that kind of reinforced this. So he had some assistants and he and they would question the mothers of many young stutterers and say, look, when did the disorder begin and how did the family react?
Mm-hmm.
And he also he basically tested age-matched normal speakers with the people who had the stuttering kids as well. So he did some kind of sciencey shaped stuff. And he found many of them also had some speech defects, so normal speakers, so to speak. But the difference was for the stutterers, and the quote here, their parents overreacted, made the children panic, and produced full-blown stuttering. So his thesis is the diagnosis causes the condition.
Yeah, okay.
And you can see the argument, like,
No. I can believe that there could be, if you're saying it's, there's triggers that, you reinforce a pattern and you make it feel worse to you and then it keeps going that way. Maybe.
He termed this the diagnosogenic, there we go, diagnosogenic theory.
That's not bad.
Produced by diagnosis. And it became the cornerstone of his writing, his teaching, his research.
So could he theoretically go and diagnose people who didn't have it and then it emerges?
It's fair to say there's a study coming.
Oh, why are people bad?
Who said he was bad? This guy cares.
Why are people bad?
This one's great. So he figured basically his disorder did not lie in his brain or his biology, but in his learnt behaviour. And years later he said, look, stuttering, this is a great sentence, stuttering begins not in the child's mouth but in the parent's ear. So the summary is for him, for Wendell Johnson, stuttering was learned. It didn't require underlying biophysiological defects.
Yep.
Therefore, it could be unlearned.
Well, okay, good.
It also meant that stuttering could be called forth. So it seems basically his argument was apparently very provocative and powerful, and it had enormous implications for speech therapy. It's time for Johnson's probably most widely famous project, the one that was later named the Monster Study. You're going to be fine. You're going to love this one. So the main goal of the study was to see whether telling non-stuttering children that they stuttered would make it happen. That's cool, right? No big deal.
Oh, dear. I mean, cool science. Just, possibly.
Finding shit out. He had a hypothesis, like it was good science.
Oh, no, it was not good science.
So far, he had a hypothesis.
It was asking a question, yes.
Yeah, it's true. His hypothesis was actually that you could. And of course, like all good academic research, it began with recruiting a grad student to do the work for you.
Yeah, well, of course.
Because he's not an idiot. So in 1938, he got one of his MA students, a 22-year-old called Mary Tudor.
Like literally the queen?
Literally Mary Tudor. Oh, it's American, so maybe they pronounced it Tudor. She was described in one source, I don't know why, as avid but timorous.
Avid but timorous? What precisely is timorous? Is that like timid?
Yeah.
But like a vibrating timid?
Vibrating timid. That sounds like a bird. Hang on, is that the warbler? No, it's the vibrating timid. So he got Mary in, and that's the start. And what did he need next? Obviously, children.
Yes.
Luckily, his uni had an existing and ongoing relationship with the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home in Devonport.
Orphans.
Yeah.
Orphans.
So
orphans.
What do you call them? The offcast, the extras.
One of my favorite books ever to read to the kids is the Lemony Snicket series, just beautiful. But the way that Count Olaf uses the word orphan as an insult and
orphan.
Well, no, he's more orphans. He's more jovial evil and
fun evil.
Yeah, fun evil. Yeah.
Portrayed in the televisions by the Doogie Howsers, right?
Yeah, by Doogie Howser.
So the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home was founded as a refuge for the offspring of men killed in the Civil War.
What year are we?
Very early 1900, like
1920, 1938. 1938.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's still going since then.
It's been around a while.
It wasn't just the orphans from the Civil War.
That's how it began. In 1939, it was the height of the Great Depression and had more than 600 orphans and what they called demi-orphans. So this is destitute parents who were alive but couldn't take care of their kids.
It's like Thor. If Thor had no parents, he becomes demi-orphan. If Odin's dead.
Yep. So they basically, you can't afford kids, so you put them in an orphanage anyway.
Oh, God.
And they were in little cottages. But apparently at least it was not as harsh as the nearby industrial school for boys.
Look, fair enough. I mean, the industrial school for boys does sound
Doesn't sound great.
No, it's like you're in the sausage factory right here.
Your parents died. Why don't you come and you're going to go to the industrial school for boys.
Oh, my God.
Which was apparently as forlorn as the Institute for the Feeble-Minded Children at Glenwood.
Jesus Christ. I like that there must have been amongst these kids some sort of bad ranking and just thinking, okay, well, at least we're not at the industrial home or at the feeble-minded home. Oh, my God.
The dickheads who name them.
No, not dickheads. People who had a bit of chutzpah and said what was on the tin.
Does what it
says. This is what they're like. We are giving explicit names, not hiding behind anything here.
Yeah, so it's good that this one, the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home, was actually it was up there.
Yeah.
In such rankings. So January 17, 1939, Mary Tudor, not the Queen, took her first of many drives to the orphans' home, and she had a notepad, chalkboards. She had a Smedley dynamometer.
Who doesn't have a Smedley dynamometer?
I have one in my pocket. It apparently measured hand strength. A lot of it to do with left and right-handedness measurements. Experimental conditions. Mm-hmm. I know you're gagging for the science.
Orphans.
Well, definitely orphans. So they chose 22 orphans who all believed they were going to receive speech therapy.
In these sorts of studies, I often think, okay, what would it be like now if you want to do this and you're filling out your ethics application?
I want some orphans.
And participants, orphans. Orphans. I can just imagine the ethics committee just...
I don't need to imagine. I'd be sitting there going, how do we help them put this differently?
Children who no longer have parents. No, that's you're not using a slur word anymore.
And live together clustered in a facility that is facilitated by government funding and or benevolent funds from, let's say, former service people. Yeah, 22 orphans. Yeah, they all thought they were going to receive speech therapy. It's not untrue.
Did they? And so we're working on the presumption they had no speech impediments before?
Oh, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Experimental conditions. So 10 of them, the teachers and the matrons, etc., at the facility said they're stutterers. So they're clearly stutterers, and that was known. So Mary and 5 other grad students, they served as judges. So they listened to the children speak and they graded them on a scale from 1 to 5. 1 is poor speech, 5 is fluent, And they agreed with the school. These 10 are stutterers.
Okay.
Like they're struggling. And they were described by the grad students and other judges with descriptions like unwilling to talk but certain definite stuttering phenomena, or tension, prolongations, explosiveness, repetitions, a stutterer.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty clear. So these 10 were divided into two groups. Group 1A, the experimental group. They were told that they did not stutter.
So these are stutterers and they're told they don't.
Yep. So they were given words, they were given sentences like this. You'll outgrow the stuttering and you will be able to speak even much better than you are speaking now. They were told, pay no attention to what others say about your speaking ability, for undoubtedly they do not realize that it's only a phase you're going through.
Okay, so they're doing the undiagnoses.
Yeah. You've got it, but that's bullshit. Don't worry about it. It's going to go away. It's cool.
Or not necessarily bullshit, but it's going to go away.
It's cool.
Yeah.
Group 1B, so the other 5 stutterers were told, yeah, your speech is garbage. It's as bad as everyone says.
And
that's it.
Okay, so they didn't say you'll have it for life.
No, it's just, it's crap. Like we agree. We concur.
Okay,
Your speech
okay,
is balls.
So they could have been more evil at this point. They limited their evil.
That might have been, but not that I saw. Mm-hmm. The other 12, so that was the 10 stutterers. The other 12 were chosen at random from the fluent orphans, as they were known colloquially.
Fluent orphans. It's a weird shopping list.
It is. So this was the first ones were Group 1A and 1B. This is Group 2A. They ranged from 5 to 15, and they were told things like this. The staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech.
Uh-huh.
You have many of the symptoms of a child who is beginning to stutter. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Do anything to keep from stuttering. Don't ever speak unless you can do it right. You see how, and they'd name a person, see how Keith stutters, don't you? Well, he undoubtedly started the same way as you.
Uh-huh.
So they were told that. Good science.
Uh-huh.
That was 2A. 2B, similar ages, 5 to 15. They were told, no, you speak great and we're going to tell you how awesome you are and your enunciation is perfect and yay for you.
Look, I get it as 4 different conditions.
It makes sense. It's science.
It is a solidly designed experiment here.
And that's all we care about.
Yeah.
Good science.
Yeah.
Well methodolized. So the experiment ran from January to May of 1939. So what's that? January, February, March, 5 months. Each session ran for about 45 minutes with every child. Every few weeks they
just say the same thing over and over again?
I think there was more to it, but it boiled down to reinforcing the particular conditions.
Man, what a boring thing to do.
For Mary.
Yeah, well, for the orphan as well, to sit there and either have them told your speech is awesome over and over again or your speech is bad. So
the first session, to sort of kick it off, so they tested the child's IQ and handedness.
Mm-hmm.
And why was that? Because there was a popular explanation for stuttering at the time that it was caused by a cerebral imbalance.
Ooh.
So basically, like if you're born left-handed, like I said earlier, and you used your right hand, you'd get these nerve impulses misfiring and it would affect your speech and other such things.
Yep.
Johnson thought this was a load of garbage, but he got tutored to check it because he could refute it.
Yep.
There was no correlation between handedness and speech impediments.
Uh-huh.
There you go. Science worked.
Well.
Anyway, how'd the experiment go? The real fun, and by fun I mean air quotes, Group 2A, people who didn't have a stutter but were told they did.
Yes, so this is the one for whom ethically wasn't a great study.
Here are some examples. After her second session, this is Mary's second session with a 5-year-old called Norma Jean Pugh, Mary wrote, it was very difficult to get her to speak, although she spoke very freely the month before. Second session.
Oh, God.
She didn't want to talk. 9-year-old Betty Romp, her final evaluation, small quotes, practically refuses to talk, held hand or arm over her eyes most of the time. Hazel Potter, 15. She was the oldest. She became much more self-conscious and she talked less. She started to snap her fingers and to try and stop herself because she'd often say before words. And so she'd snap her fingers to try and stop her saying and was also a symptom of trying to correct herself.
Yep.
They all performed worse in their academics and in class. One boy refused to read anymore in class. He wouldn't recite stuff. An 11-year-old called Clarence, who was described for some fucking reason, chubby and diffident child. To be fair, that's how most of my school reports from primary school were as well, chubby, diffident. He began to start anxiously correcting himself and tutors words. He stopped and told me he was going to have trouble on words before he even said them.
Oh, wow.
She asked him how he knew, and he said, look, that sound wouldn't come out. It feels like it's stuck there.
Ugh.
12-year-old woman called Mary, or a girl at the time, tutor asked her, did your best friend know about your stuttering? And she said, no, because I hardly ever talk to her now.
Oh, great. Yep. Cool.
2 years later, she ran away from the orphanage and ended up at the rougher industrial school for girls.
I feel like the naming of these places it really says this. Just the way they go. This is what you are forever. Like we can merit-based economy. No, this is just
you are a factory.
You are
a piece of a factory now. You're 4. That'll do. So overall, the experiment was a complete failure, like utter failure. So 6 normal children who were called stutterers, 2 improved their speech fluency, 2 had no change, and 2, their fluency fell a bit, but the numbers were tiny. Like they judge it on a scale that's 1 to 5, and they changed.
But didn't you just tell me the stories of people that got a lot worse?
This is on stuttering.
Oh, okay.
On stuttering.
Right. Okay.
Not whether they got worse.
Yeah, okay.
From the actual stutterers who were told that they spoke okay, 2 showed a slight improvement in their fluency, 2 decreased a bit, and 1 didn't change. So it was like no noticeable effects. But there were some enduring effects. You kind of noticed this earlier. All the non-stuttering children who were told they did stutter acted like stutterers except for the stuttering. So they exhibited the other behavioural changes. So they didn't actually start to choke on words, but they do things like they'd become more inhibited, they were more sensitive, they were embarrassed to speak around people, they were less talkative. So basically they got bludgeoned down, but it didn't make them stutterers.
That's so weird. Okay.
Yeah. So in their sessions, they'd do things like they'd shuffle their feet, they'd whisper, they'd snap their fingers, they'd gulp, they'd clamp their mouths shut, hands over the eyes, all that stuff. So that's what you're asking a moment ago.
So they assumed they did, but their speech actually didn't get worse. Wow.
They just got wigged out about it.
Cool. We can wig people out though.
Yep.
I mean, that's
Yay.
we can do that.
Who would have known? By 1936, who fucking knew we could freak people out as children?
Science proves finally that we can freak them out.
Yep, you can break people. So they acted like stutterers, but they weren't.
Oh, okay. That's something. Something.
It was definitely an effect.
It's a something.
The science worked. So that was the main thing. It just didn't work. So what happened? What happened to the research? What happened to Mary? What happened to the orphans? So after Mary submitted her thesis, 1939, she felt bad. She went back to the orphanage a few times, and she'd basically try and do some follow-up care, some therapy.
Did they take her thesis away for that?
Nope.
Shouldn't feel bad for doing science.
No.
Certainly not in that time.
She told the children who were not stutterers but told they were, you're fine. And she tried to help them get that they were okay. And she wrote a letter to Johnson the year after that basically, there's a few quotes I saw in an article, but basically she said, very Passag in 1940, junior woman to senior male, I believe that in time those people, will recover, but we certainly have made...
The orphans.
Yep, the ones who were told they did when they didn't. They'll recover, but we certainly made a definite impression on them.
Oh, well.
Isn't that delicately put?
That's not that Passag. She's just saying we made an impression.
Her thesis apparently sank immediately into obscurity. It just disappeared.
Ah.
So Johnson, the supervisor, as her supervisor, he did not oversee her publication, which was really common, and co-publish. Yeah. He wrote a book or a comprehensive index of the University of Iowa's stuttering research. So it was the name University for Stuttering Research. He wrote a comprehensive index and did not include that study in it.
Okay. Well, he must have known this seems a bit problematic.
He had inklings.
At some point, I mean, how involved was he in the study? He supervised.
Designed it and stuff.
He designed?
It was his work. He used to do it. But apparently it had a ghost life among Iowa speech pathology students because it was in the library.
Yeah, okay.
And so there was another student who was a former student of Johnson's who became a speech pathology professor. Fuck, this is hard. Messing up words in a speech pathology podcast. So he said, look, those who'd heard of the study nicknamed it the monster study. It reminded people of Nazi experiments on human subjects.
Of the time. It's right in there.
Of the time, wasn't it? Other professors at the time told Wendell Johnson it would ruin his reputation if he published this.
But you can imagine any school.
Yeah.
That there is always going to be Studies that stand out that another student did recently or a while ago, and they spread stories. People will say, "Oh, well, there was that story."
Have you read it?
I love the idea of research that the students of a school will pass around. It's not public, but there's always the strong.
We all know it's there.
The ghost study.
Yeah,
that's great.
The ghost
great
thing.
term.
Apparently, it was also described as it was chilling and disturbing, especially to think that Wendell Johnson, of all people, had sanctioned this research. He knew of the pain of being told that you're a stutterer. So people were there was a weird kind of contradiction because he was very empathetic about folk in this situation, but off it went. Also, there were lawsuits. Hard to imagine. So in 2003,
I didn't think orphans could. Like, I thought that was the point.
Do you know what they do, though? They marry a decent member of society.
Work their way into citizenship, and then they can.
Because remember, these aren't the industrial school orphans.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
These are the good ones. So in 2003, anyway, there were 3 surviving orphans from the "You don't stutter, but we're going to tell you that you do" group.
Yes,
the most messed with group.
Yeah.
So they all 3 of them sued the state and the University of Iowa for millions, and many of the things they said were, infliction of emotional distress, fraudulent misrepresentation of what they were participating in, blah, blah, blah. So one of them said she's thought of herself as a freak all her life. She still hates to talk, except to her family and a few people in church.
So it's just 60 years later?
Yeah, something like. Another, imagine trying to wreck a child's voice. I've moved on. I married a good man. I talk okay. And one other one, I could never tell my husband about it. It just ruined my life. So they're pretty upset. 2001, the University of Iowa issued an apology. They called the experiment both regrettable and indefensible. So we're sorry.
That is such lawyer speak.
Isn't it? But I tried to find out if this got paid out. And the best I could find was a little snippet in Wikipedia that said the university paid a settlement to some of the surviving folks of over around $900,000 in 2007. So some money appears to have changed hands, but not a lot. And later, they would have been fucking old. Very, very old. And Wendell himself, so he defended his diagnosogenic theory right till the end of his life. Like he was like, nope, you get the diagnosis, that causes it. And apparently he had a massive heart attack at 59 while he was still writing a 4,000-word essay for the Encyclopedia Britannica on speech disorders. And it's difficult to tell. It's a bit ambiguous whether he was literally writing it and slumped over his desk or this is one of the things he was doing when he died. So he had a colossal heart attack at 59.
Oh, that's not good.
But the piece for the encyclopedia was published posthumously, and it included a lot of emphatic words about how people with speech disorders have traditionally known the scorn, ridicule, and even revulsion of their society. So he was very clear that people with these disorders feel fucked and they get treated badly and they feel terrible. So it's interesting he had this kind of this empathy. And many people who became big in the speech pathology world in the early 21st century at least were students of his. And they became, eminent professors, etc. And they really thought he was a great dude. Like they saying he was a nice man who really gave a shit. And so one of them says,
could be, and he had a lapse. He had a bad moment. He had a
well. They also some of the things they say is like he thought he was trying to do a good thing. Like so there's one guy who was the vice president and emeritus dean of Uni of Iowa. His name is Spriestersbach. But he said things like this, look, Wendell was a wonderful, empathetic man and he understood the torment of a speech defect. He wouldn't have been able to bear it if he thought he'd actually forced someone to stutter, which sounds strangely contradictory. He goes on to say, I have to assume it was because he firmly believed it would serve a greater good, that it would help others who stuttered reverse it, fix it, whatever.
Do you know, you could have, I mean.
There are other ways to do it.
Ethically, I don't know how this is, but if you believe in this diagnosogenic thing, you could have just gone with, all right, let's try to tell those people, that have it, okay, it's going to go away. Let's see what that does.
Yeah.
And that's not as ethically bad. I don't think it's ethically good, but.
Well, I mean, not surprisingly, he wanted to demonstrate that he was right, and he tried. So bottom line was a lot of his work about what happens after stuttering begins still stands.
Yeah, okay.
Once it started, but what he never cracked was what causes it.
What caused it? Okay.
So the current models say genetic, biology, et cetera, but environmental conditions need to tweak it usually. So you can have a predisposition, but that doesn't mean it'll go full on.
Do you have anything on stuttering rates? Like, are they going down over time?
I haven't seen a trend analysis. I didn't look for it, but there's something like 1% of the population, at least in the US.
Yeah, okay.
But they do. It does seem to suggest that a stressed out parent and an overactive focus on the problem can certainly exacerbate it, but not cause it.
I can just imagine that there might have been 100 years ago a much stricter parenting regime that might have
and school.
Yeah. Well, particularly for an orphan, but that might have softened quite a bit. In that time.
I don't think he was a bad guy. Like, I think he was genuinely trying to pinpoint what was going on. The problem was if you're the orphan who was in the group that really needed to be.
Look, it's not rocket science, but when you're planning your experiment, don't try and trigger a condition.
And the irony was he didn't trigger the condition, but he certainly managed to fuck them up.
But we could explore if radiation leads to cancer by getting a random set of people and putting a whole lump of uranium in their underpants, and let's see what happens.
I've got some in my mind.
But I don't know if that's the way that we should approach science.
No, because we already know it does. I see what you're saying. That you're making a bigger point. You're making a bigger point. Yeah, not specifics.
So we don't try and trigger things. We just don't.
Not anymore. But the monster study did.